The echoes of an era. You could almost hear Britain before you saw it in the 1980s. A nation waking up to the sound of rattling milk bottles on doorsteps, the squeak of bicycle wheels on damp pavement, and the faint buzz of televisions humming in the background. These weren't just noises. They were signals of a time when community rhythms still shaped everyday life. But today, many of those sounds have vanished, replaced by the quiet glow of smartphones and the endless scroll of digital feeds. For those who grew up in Britain during the 80s, these fragments of memory linger like ghostly echoes. They remind us that the past was not only about what we did, but how it felt, the textures, the smells, the rituals that built a shared identity. The 80s were not simply a decade of pop culture fads. They were a bridge between the analog world and the digital revolution that would soon follow. Think about it. Britain in the early 80s was recovering from economic struggles, political upheavals, and cultural tension. Yet, amid all that, everyday life brimmed with small wonders. Children woke before dawn to deliver newspapers, not to scroll TikTok. Families gathered around the same television, because missing a show meant waiting an entire week for another chance. There was no streaming safety net. Even a simple device like the SodaStream or the Sony Walkman became symbols of independence, control, and personal expression. And perhaps that's what makes nostalgia so powerful. The realization that what seemed ordinary then was extraordinary in hindsight. The milkman's morning routine wasn't just about delivering dairy. It was about trust, repetition, and the comfort of knowing tomorrow would start the same way. The clumsy ZX Spectrum computer wasn't merely a machine. It was a gateway into coding, gaming, and dreaming about the future. In each of these details, Britain of the 1980s was teaching its children something profound: discipline, patience, and the art of finding joy in simplicity. But let's be honest, memory is tricky. We often romanticize what was inconvenient, slow, or even frustrating. Waiting 10 minutes for a cassette game to load on the ZX Spectrum would drive us mad today. And yet, people remember that very frustration fondly. Why? Because it wasn't wasted time. It was anticipation, and anticipation is a feeling modern life has almost erased. That's why revisiting the 1980s isn't just about indulging in nostalgia. It's about rediscovering what we may have lost in the speed of progress. It's about asking, what did these rituals teach us that we no longer pass on? And more importantly, which of those lessons are worth bringing back? In this series, the British Chronicle will unearth 20 unforgettable elements of 80s Britain, from toys and technology to TV shows and school lunches. Some may bring a smile, others a pang of longing, but all of them tell us something about who we were and how we became who we are today. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. What's the first sound, smell, or image that takes you back to the 1980s? Share it in the comments below. Your story might resonate with someone else watching. And if you want to journey with us deeper into the heart of Britain's past, don't forget to subscribe to the British Chronicle. Together, let's make sure that these echoes are never forgotten. The building blocks of a decade. When we talk about the 1980s in Britain, we're not only talking about style and entertainment, we're talking about the very tools that shaped how people lived, worked, and dreamed. This was the decade when technology crept into living rooms, when households were still local in character, and when even the simplest devices seemed revolutionary. Take the ZX Spectrum, for example. Launched in 1982, it wasn't just a gadget for a few hobbyists. It was a cultural shift. For the first time, kids across Britain were learning the basics of coding in their bedrooms, tapping out lines of basic commands with a mixture of excitement and fear that the machine might freeze. By today's standards, its rubber keys and screeching cassette tapes feel painfully slow. But back then, this was magic. It wasn't about graphics or speed. It was about ownership of a new world. The Spectrum democratized computing in a way few devices ever have. And yet, it wasn't alone. The Sony Walkman, with its chunky headphones and pocket-sized cassette player, offered something equally radical: privacy. Before the Walkman, music was communal, blaring from radios or record players. With it, suddenly every walk to school or bus ride became a personal soundtrack. The sound may have been tinny, the batteries drained too quickly, but it gave teenagers something priceless: independence in an age when individuality was still being discovered. Meanwhile, inside British kitchens, the soda stream became a badge of pride. Parents hoped it would save money, but for kids it was a science experiment with flavor. A hiss, a fizz, and suddenly tap water transformed into something worth bragging about. It was clumsy, messy, and often overdone. But that was the point. It wasn't just about the drink, it was about the ritual, the feeling of creating something with your own hands. Beyond gadgets, the foundation of 80s Britain rested on community spaces. The local greengrocer wasn't just a place to buy apples, it was a human connection, a ritual of recognition. The usual love? Wasn't just a phrase, it was an affirmation of belonging. Shops weren't faceless chains, they were threads in the social fabric. Walking into one was as much about being remembered as it was about buying food. Looking back, these things, computers, Walkmans, soda streams, greengrocers, might feel small, even quaint. But in truth, they were the cornerstones of a new kind of society. They taught independence, creativity, and responsibility, all while anchoring people in shared local experiences. They were the raw materials of nostalgia, and more importantly, the seeds of habits that shaped Britain for decades to come. And maybe that's the real lesson of the 80s. Progress wasn't just about the big headlines or political shifts, it was about the small, tangible things that quietly changed how people felt about themselves and their world. What about you? Was your first taste of independence a Walkman, a computer, or even a Saturday paper round? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to see which details resonate most. And don't forget, if you're enjoying this journey back through time, hit subscribe to the British Chronicle so you won't miss the next chapter in our exploration of Britain's unforgettable decade. When culture took center stage. By the mid-1980s, Britain wasn't just living through a decade, it was performing it. If the gadgets and shops of everyday life gave the era its foundation, then television, music, and popular culture lit the spark that made it unforgettable. Few imports hit British screens as explosively as Knight Rider. When Michael Knight rolled onto ITV with his talking car, Kitty T, Friday nights transformed. This wasn't just another TV show, it was spectacle. Kids debated episodes in playgrounds, adults marveled at the technology, and every break in transmission felt unbearable. Yet Knight Rider's appeal wasn't only about action. It represented a window into slick, futuristic America, a vision of confidence and coolness at a time when Britain was still wrestling with economic scars. In hindsight, what we were watching wasn't just entertainment, it was aspiration. But television was never just about heroes and cars. For children, the Saturday morning cartoon ritual became sacred. There were no streaming platforms, no second chances. If you missed the broadcast, you missed the story and the conversation on Monday morning. Shows like He-Man, Dungeons and Dragons, or The Raccoons weren't only entertainment. They were cultural glue. They shaped imagination, playtime, and even playground hierarchies. That sense of collective viewing, millions of kids eating cereal in sync, has almost vanished today, and perhaps that's why we miss it so fiercely. And let's not forget Swap Shop and Tiswas. These weren't polished productions, they were chaotic, unpredictable, and alive. Children could phone in, trade toys, and even get doused in custard pies. It was messy, interactive television at its best. Proof that sometimes imperfection is what makes an experience unforgettable. Compare that to today's heavily produced YouTube shows, and you realize how much charm spontaneity once held. Music, too, carried its own pulse. Smash Hits magazine gave teenagers glossy posters, cheeky interviews, and the full lyrics to songs they replayed endlessly on cassette players. For a generation without Spotify or YouTube, this was how you claimed identity. Pop wasn't just sound, it was visual, tactile, and larger than life. Holding a copy of Smash Hits felt like belonging to a secret society of fans who understood that music was about more than melodies, it was about lifestyle. All of this, Knight Rider, Saturday cartoons, Smash Hits, might seem like simple nostalgia, but together they reveal something deeper. The 80s weren't simply about consuming entertainment, they were about sharing it. Collective experience mattered more than personal convenience. The ritual of waiting, of gathering, of participating together gave culture its weight. Today, when everything is on demand, instant and solitary, we rarely feel that same communal spark. And maybe that's the bittersweet truth. The culture of the 80s mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was fleeting. Each moment felt rare, and rarity makes memory precious. What about you? What was your Saturday morning ritual? Did you race to the TV before the cartoon started? Or were you more of a smash hits reader memorizing every lyric? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to see which memory comes alive for you. And if you want to keep exploring the highs and lows of Britain's most colorful decade, don't forget to subscribe to the British Chronicle. More memories are waiting. Shaping society through everyday rituals. By the late 1980s, it was clear that Britain wasn't just living through a decade of gadgets and shows, it was living through a transformation of identity. Every trend, every ritual, carried echoes of how society was changing, and the reactions were as diverse as the people experiencing them. Take fashion. Nothing screamed 80s Britain louder than the shell suit, a swishy, shiny outfit in neon colors that somehow managed to be both ridiculous and irresistible. At the time, it was a status symbol for kids and teenagers. Matching tops and bottoms were non-negotiable, and the louder the pattern, the cooler you seemed. Looking back, we laugh at the photographs, but the shell suit was more than a fashion crime. It symbolized a generation experimenting with self-expression, stepping out of the gray shadows of the 70s into a world of color and confidence. It was defiance stitched in polyester. Meanwhile, community rituals remained powerful. The milkman's early morning delivery with glass bottles clinking softly on the doorstep wasn't just about convenience. It was about rhythm, trust, and continuity. Returning empties, peeling back the foil tops, even swatting away the cheeky birds who pecked at the cream, these were moments that connected households to something bigger. When supermarkets and plastic packaging began to take over, many felt something deeply human was being lost. The same could be said for local shops. The greengrocer, the record store, the corner shop, they weren't faceless transactions, they were relationships. Shopkeepers knew your name, your preferences, even the little gossip of the street. By the late 80s, as supermarkets expanded, people noticed the difference. Shopping became efficient but less personal. It was a trade-off between modern convenience and the intimacy of human connection, and not everyone welcomed the change. Television also mirrored society's anxieties. Beyond the fun of cartoons and dramas, the public information films stood as stark reminders of real dangers: electric substations, road crossings, stranger danger. Their eerie music and chilling narration unsettled children for life. Yet they reveal how the state tried to shape responsible citizens through fear and caution. Today, we might see them as heavy-handed, even traumatizing, but at the time, they were accepted as necessary. And then there was advertising. TV jingles for sweets, cereals, and bikes became part of the national soundtrack. Parents rolled their eyes, kids sang them endlessly at school, and society as a whole learned that commercials could be just as memorable as the shows themselves. It blurred the line between culture and consumerism, sparking debates about whether childhood was being sold to the highest bidder. The truth is, the 80s were a battleground of old and new. Tradition versus modernization, community versus consumerism, identity versus conformity. Every milk bottle, every shell suit, every cartoon carried hidden weight. Some embraced the change, others resisted, but no one escaped its influence. Looking back, it's tempting to only see the fun, the color, the laughter. But beneath that surface was a society negotiating its place in a rapidly modernizing world. And perhaps that's why the 80s are remembered with such intensity. They weren't just playful, they were pivotal. What about you? Do you remember those milk bottles, those corner shop conversations? Or maybe your very first shell suit? Which of these everyday rituals felt most important to you? Share your memories in the comments. I'd love to see how your story fits into Britain's bigger picture. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the British Chronicle so we can keep exploring these fascinating layers of history together. Lessons, legacy, and what remains. Decades come and go, but the best of them leave more than fashions and fads. They leave fingerprints on the way we live. The 1980s in Britain may look distant now, wrapped in neon colors and cassette tapes, but its legacy is surprisingly alive. Think of the ZX Spectrum and the early home computing boom. What seemed like a quirky rubber-keyed novelty became the seedbed for Britain's digital future. Many of the programmers and entrepreneurs who would later shape the gaming industry, or even Silicon Roundabout in London, first cut their teeth on those clunky machines. The lesson? Sometimes the most awkward, imperfect tools are the ones that unleash the most creativity. Or take the Sony Walkman. Yes, it has long been replaced by streaming services, but the very idea of music on the move started there. The legacy isn't just technological, it's psychological. It gave people permission to curate their own world, to build an identity through sound. Every pair of AirPods today owes a silent debt to those chunky foam headphones of the 80s. And then there are the rituals of community and routine. The milkman, the greengrocer, the corner shop. They taught us that life was not only about efficiency but about connection. Losing those spaces revealed how fragile community bonds could be. Today, as farmers markets and independent shops see a quiet resurgence, you can sense the nostalgia pulling people back towards something slower, more personal, more human. The 80s didn't just disappear, they left us longing for what we lost. The fashion and pop culture of the era, from shell suits to smash hits magazine, might look superficial at first glance. Yet they carried deeper values: confidence, individuality, and a sense that young voices mattered. Teenagers weren't just consumers, they were cultural drivers. That shift has only grown, and you can trace its roots right back to the loud, unapologetic self-expression of the 80s. Even the food, school puddings like jam roly-poly or cornflake tart, wasn't only about sweetness. It was about comfort, about memory, about a shared taste that united generations of schoolchildren. Mention those desserts today, and you'll spark instant recognition. The legacy of the 80s isn't only in technology or fashion. It's in flavors, sounds, and textures that live rent-free in memory. The real value of remembering the 1980s is not just in nostalgia, it's in reflection. That decade teaches us the power of anticipation in a world that now moves too fast. It reminds us that connection matters more than convenience, that individuality blooms best when it's earned, and that even the smallest rituals can carry the biggest meaning. So when we look back, we're not just smiling at funny clothes or retro gadgets. We're remembering how it felt to live in a world where patience, community, and shared experience defined everyday life. That's a legacy worth holding on to. What about you? Which part of the 80s still lives in your daily habits? Maybe the way you listen to music, the way you shop, or even the way you treat time. Tell us in the comments, and let's keep this conversation alive. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the British Chronicle so you won't miss the final part of our journey through Britain's unforgettable decade. Closing reflections and the open ending. We've wandered together through the streets, the shops, the living rooms, and the playgrounds of 1980s Britain. We've heard the clink of milk bottles at dawn, felt the thrill of a new video rental, tasted the syrupy fizz of homemade cola, and remembered the joy of cartoons that only appeared once a week. Each fragment of memory has told us something larger, that the past is not gone. It lingers, quietly shaping how we live today. The decade was messy. It was colorful, loud, sometimes tacky, often frustrating, but it was also full of firsts. The first time technology felt personal, the first time fashion shouted with neon confidence, the first time kids could carry their own soundtrack in their pocket. Looking back, the 80s gave Britain more than nostalgia. It gave it a vocabulary of independence, imagination, and connection. And yet, memory is never complete. For every ZX Spectrum or Walkman that makes the highlight reels, there are smaller, quieter stories waiting to be told. The street games at dusk, the smell of freshly printed magazines, the nervous thrill of calling into a live TV show. These are the invisible threads of history, the ones that don't make headlines but do make us who we are. Perhaps that's the beauty of nostalgia. It's not about freezing the past like an artifact in a museum. It's about revisiting it, questioning it, and carrying forward the lessons we still need. In a world where everything feels instant and disposable, the 80s remind us that waiting could be exciting, that community mattered, and that joy often came in the simplest forms. But here's the question we end with. Was it really just about the past? Or are these echoes trying to tell us something about the present and even the future? Maybe the rituals of patience, the charm of shared experiences, and the value of connection are not just nostalgic memories, but guideposts we've forgotten to follow. So, as we close this journey, the real story isn't finished. It's still being written, by you, by your memories, and by the conversations we keep alive. Tell me, if you could bring back just one thing from 1980s Britain, not just as a memory, but as a living part of today, which would it be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the missing piece of someone else's nostalgia. And if this trip through time has sparked a smile, a memory, or even a question, then join us again. Subscribe to the British Chronicle and help keep these echoes alive. Because sometimes the past isn't gone. It's just waiting for us to listen.